Galveston, Texas, September 14, 1914.
And who are your parents?
Say that again?
Who are your parents?
Colonel Daniel J. Carr, C-A-R-R. Colonel Daniel J. Carr and Helen Carr.
And he was a colonel in the army?
Yeah. He was what you used to call a chicken colonel. He was chief signal officer of the Third Army.
Okay. Do you have any brothers or sisters?
One brother, Dan, a sister, Helen, and a sister, Catherine. All three dead.
And are you the oldest or the youngest?
Say that again?
Are you the oldest or the youngest?
Youngest.
Okay.
Youngest of the four. I'm from a family basically military on my father's side, of course, military. He was a ranking officer. Won't need not get into that, but I'm always proud of the fact that he was the chief signal officer of the Third Army, and a very capable man, and entered the military as a young man, and then rose on up, and finally he was not a West Pointer. He was college, so finally he ended up as what we used to call a chicken colonel. That's where full-fledged colonel. And he was chief signal officer of the Third Army. He was a veteran of 2 or 3 wars: Spanish-American War, another war in South America, and in the First World War. He was a very well-established military man, highly regarded, but not a West Pointer. And in those days, no matter what you did or where you went to school, if you were not a West Pointer, the chance of you being a general almost unthinkable.
Right.
But he was what we call a full-fledged colonel, and was chief signal officer of the Third Army.
Right.
I'm very proud of that. My mother came from a very wealthy family. My father did not come from a wealthy family. So there was always a sort of an inequality there in the background as far as money was concerned. And I grew up, partly at least, in Depression years, when money made the difference. I won't get into all of that, but I had many, many advantages as a young man due to connection, political and academic. I lived in San Antonio, Texas, military establishments.
So that's near the center.
Military, Texas was always a big military area because of plenty of ground to practice military stuff on, and far enough in the South and otherwise to draw people. So Texas was always a big figure in military life. Not Annapolis, but West Point.
Were your parents both Catholic?
My parents were both Catholic.
Okay, so they were both Catholic. And was anyone else in your family? Was anyone else in your family, did they end up as religious or in the religious life?
Entered religious life?
Yeah.
No, they were, it's a good question. They were, tended to be very religious people, Irish Catholics.
Okay.
But I was the only one that I know of in my family ever entered religious. I touched on the military because we lived in military posts, but the influence was strongly Roman Catholic, and because my family had no real financial problems, we always had the advantage of going to the best schools, even if you had to pay for it in those days. Well, the big thing in my childhood, aeronautics, airplanes.
Oh, you
Yeah.
built airplanes?
Oh, yeah, we built the airplanes. But say that was in 1927, and then right through the end. And then not long after that, while I was still a young man, I worked for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. I was a technician on the aeronautical engineering. Well, an uncle who was very much into cockfighting.
Oh, really?
So I had the experience and exposure to people who had money, wherewithal, to engage in activities that were interesting and had a certain importance, but didn't bring in any money. Otherwise, I could say that up until the Depression. His name was Ed Talty, T-A-L-T-Y.
That was your mother's brother?
Good guess, my mother's brother, yeah. He was an expert in very odd things, like cockfighting was a big clerical work for public utility, financial clerical work.
Like accounting?
Yeah, well, it wasn't that high level, but they didn't call it accounting, you know. And when I was very young, a congressman from Indiana got me a job with the NACA, National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. So I was in research at Langley Field in Hampton, Virginia, in aeronautical research when I was 18, 19, learning the technical aspects of aeronautics and very in contact with aeronautics when I was young. And I was a technician, rather low grade, but I was a technician under aeronautical engineers. So early on, I got an interest in technical stuff.
Science.
Mechanical, especially, aeronautics. Well, people your age would be too young to realize the incredible impact of Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic in 1937. And boys of any amounted to anything at all, maybe girls to some extent, got into what? Aeronautics. Airplane.
The swine is the
So I flew in an airplane for the first time when I was about 15 or 16. And boy, did I brag about that to my companions, because I had good connections because of the military. National University Law School. That was a federal government law school. A lot of people know the federal government started universities about 1900. It never turned out the way the government hoped, that there would be a national law school, a national medical school, a national engineering school, all paid for by the federal government, all that chain. But I went under the auspices of the federal government into aeronautics.
Okay. So that was for
I was a low grade aeronautical technician in 1932, 1933, I guess it was. I went to law school.
In school, what were your favorite? At George Washington University,
Yeah.
what were your favorite subjects there?
English literature.
English literature?
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. You were a magazine editor too, weren't you?
What a memory you have.
I read.
And I did that enormous, everything I did was pretty second rate. It was second rate. But it was geared to second rate people. So I edited the biggest magazine in the country for priests.
Okay.
Whatever it was. I did an enormous amount of writing, getting $50, $100, whatever. I wrote. I'm bragging, man. I don't like. I don't know how many. I don't know, 100 or more stuff that was published. Mostly because most of it got paid. I liked the recognition, and I was published in a number of different magazines. But the checks would come in, and that's what made the difference. But I always had a strong tendency towards literature and writing. So I got into memorizing poetry. Was the schooner Hesper should sail the wintry sea? The skipper had taken his daughter to bear him company. Blue were her eyes, the fair. It was the schooner Hesper, sir. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary, o'er many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, suddenly there came a rapping, as if someone tapping at my chamber door. I remember 'twas in December, and his dying ember wrote that. That's famous American poet. Oh, don't get me into that. That's all. Then I studied literature at Harvard, and I always had an interest in literary creation. I was second rate, I would say. But I had a lot of experience to the extent that I'm not an athlete, and I'm not. I've had a lot of athletic experience, always on the second grade stuff. Pole vaulting, I was a pole vaulter, second grade. I was played football, second grade. Everything I did, boxing, I boxed.
Did you really box?
Always second grade. I just wasn't one of those people who rose to the top. Very, very competitive. And if you mounted anything, you had to play football, even if you were really good at it. That and automobile racing. The automobiles are just beginning to get stronger and faster and so forth in the early 30s, late 20s and early 30s. I'm talking about 1932, 33, 30, 35, along in that period. So I went to George Washington University in 1933, I think. So I was deep in church law. It's called canon law. I got a doctorate in canon law, which included, to some extent, secular, but I had the advantage that most canon lawyers didn't have. I was a graduate of law school, and I was a member of the bar, and so forth. And so when I went into church law, I was sort of in a privileged position because I was already a lawyer. I was already a lawyer in civil law.
But was that, did you go to school in Rome for canon law? Did you go?
I went to Catholic University of America. They had a very good law school. I had some courses, I guess, in Rome. I forget now, but basically it was Catholic University of America. That's where the big canon law school was and is. So many, you go in dioceses, the chancellor or the vice chancellor frequently has studied canon law. And they probably, not necessarily, probably in good measure at Catholic University of America.
What impressed you about President Roosevelt?
Facing hitherto problems that had not confronted the world of educators. All of a sudden, the bottom fell out of everything economically. So the plans that they had begun in the middle 20s and the late 20s, all of a sudden were financially collapsed with the Depression. So I would say that that was a high point in my life because I got a job in 1932, 33 at about $18 a week, which was very fortunate. Anybody who went through those periods, and you probably have relatives, it was a very, very, very difficult time. And the federal government came in under Roosevelt and supported a lot of these things that before that had no support. So if your family couldn't afford you to send you to school, you didn't go to school. But you probably remember, and it's very easy to do the research, the federal government, when it came in 1941, 42, tremendous thrust forward in the world of education and development, and the government poured a lot of attention, a lot of money. So the 40s, and that's a period when I was especially into school. If I had not had the fortune to be born during that period, I probably wouldn't have had the advantages that I had. That's a good question. The whole idea of what we came to call dates, having a date with a girl, began in Depression years, or early Depression years. I got a date with a new girl in 1931, 1932. The world of sexuality opened out vividly, you might say dramatically, and in many ways wrongly, with a sudden bursting of frankness and openness in sexual matters. So that I grew up in that early period where all of a sudden you could talk about things that before that were strictly silent. It opened up vistas, we say, views and opportunities of frankness and open speech that hitherto had been very closeted and unpermitted. It was a part of a breakdown financially, and some people would say a breakdown of the moral code. Sexuality became very commonly practiced and used in those years. Well, it always has been. But once things began to fall apart in the late 20s, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. All the traditions that we lived by, customs and so forth, tended to fall apart.
Okay.
Why? Because the economy fell apart. And in a sense, it sounds, every darn thing is based in the breakdown of sexual morality and other types of morality, integrity, personal honesty, financial dealing. These things were all brutalized by the Depression. Anything goes if you can be supported by it. And the result was that people who came through my era, say 1914 I was born, so 1934 I was 20 years of age, we were very much influenced by morality that was introduced as very open and outspoken with regard to intimate details of human relationships, especially in the area of sexuality, but also financial. Because once one grasped how everything economically fell apart in the Depression, everything else that was tied in with the economy underwent dramatic changes too. So people took jobs that were borderline morality that they would not have thought of doing 3 or 4 or 5 or 3 years before. So what I'm trying to say is that the Depression years, 1929, 30, 31, 32, the Depression years were, in a sense, anything goes. Anything goes. If you get what you need to live, buy it.
Right.
So pornography always existed. But pornography became very, very popular in the Depression years because anything will sell that will sell this.
Okay. So you would say that you basically were turning away from the world.
Well,
that was a strong motivation
that would be
for turning.
exactly. The basic idea is across the board economic hardship. Period. That means, for example, that people who had never done ordinary cleaning work, or sanitary work, did it because they had to, because there was no other jobs available that paid. So in a sense, without being, I wouldn't want to say that everything in a sense, is rooted in ethics and morality, but it's rooted in the economy. So a good economy tends to support values that are very human. My deepest longings for the meaning to life in the best sense. Life is not a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury signifying nothing. Life is filled with significance. And to me, the Christian faith, I've tried to study other religions too, comes closest to answering any questions that I consider necessary for myself, and perhaps in many ways definitely necessary for everyone to live the type of life that the Christian is called.
From the beginning, or did you?
I was born into a strict Roman Catholic family, and we were enveloped, so to speak, not with a kind of a false enthusiasm, but with a deep appreciation of what it meant to be a Christian, to be a Catholic. Because my family on both sides, for God knows how many hundreds of years, Irish mostly, had been Roman Catholic. And as I moved along through life, it more and more met my needs and my desires with regard to goodness and truth. Goodness and truth. I felt that the faith that I was given and that I received by God's grace, gave me everything I needed in the area of the will and the area of the intellect. The two most important, as you know, better than I, two most important qualities we have are spiritual. The desire for truth and the desire for love, for goodness and truth. And I felt by God's grace, that the Catholic religion came as close as I needed and as close as I believed it would be humanly possible by God's grace.
Oh, okay.
If I say so. People in this time of history understand the Christian faith much, much better than they did 50, 75, 100 years ago. It has opened up in vistas and horizons of experience and of academic milieu and of witness on many levels to the practical bearing of Christian truth, which fundamentally, we believe, corresponds with the deepest human needs. Not just Catholic or Christian needs, but the deepest human needs are responded to by the teaching and the discipline, I might say, of what we call the Roman Catholic Church. Basically, it's a form of Christianity that we accept as being authentic, and if one lives it, as we believe history has demonstrated in one's own life, and in a more universal sense, that if you will accept as best you can, by grace, the truth that you're taught, then you will live a life that has deep meaning and even joy. And truth, basically truth. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. The way without whom we cannot go, the truth without whom we cannot know, and the life without whom we cannot live. And if we accept deeply, by God's grace, the teachings of our Christian faith, then we find that life has meaning. It's not a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing. No, it's rich with meaning. And where there's more truth, there's more joy. And Jesus said, I've come that your joy may be full, and your joy no one can take from you. And we believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. The way without whom we cannot go, the truth without whom we cannot know, and the life without whom we cannot live, and so on, and so on, and so on.
Okay. So you feel that the public doesn't really understand that?
No, I would say that there are areas of the public, which is a very big idea,
Yeah.
which are still ill-informed, and maybe in some areas still under adverse criticisms that are not valid. It's inevitable in a religion as generally accepted as it is, and in a way doesn't make a whole lot of demands on you to accept it. Just have to have what we call have the faith, believe it, and experience it. And where there's more truth, there's more joy. So we might say that the most fundamental reality of living a real, genuine Christian life is the joy and the peace of conscience that one feels. The joy.
Would you say that your religion has affected every aspect of your life?
Every aspect of life over which I have any control,
Okay.
it has affected.
Okay, that's the piece.
Is that a fair answer?
Yeah, yeah, because you have things that you can't control. That's something to consider.
You asked a good
I
question.
understand. You entered the Franciscans in 1938.
That's correct.
Right. Now, you entered the Franciscans before you finished college or after?
Partway through.
Okay, so you became a friar before you
That's the
finished
proper
college.
word, friar.
Yes.
Just before I finished law school.
And you were influenced mostly by your early education experience.
As a Christian or what?
Well, that's what made you look seriously at the
I
Franciscans.
had, from many point of view, no credit to me, I was privileged.
Yes, but what made you look at the Franciscans so seriously? Is it because of your early education?
Because a very dear friend of mine in 1936, entered the Franciscan order, and I visited him at the Franciscan house in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
And it was such a wonderful opening out that I had never envisioned. I was a Catholic and so forth, but to enter into a Franciscan community, and still true to some extent of the Franciscans, there's a certain joy, a certain enthusiasm that tends to communicate itself. Maybe it was more palpable in those early days than it became later. But it was such a powerful impact just for the first or second time to go to a Franciscan house and share with the brothers a religious observance, mass, whatever, a dinner and a recreation, conversation, and just to experience let me make a point there, brother. The joy that I felt that they knew and that I could feel by doing the same thing I did. Where there's more truth, there's more joy. And by God's grace, I believed in the Christian Christ, Catholic faith, and I believed in some way I could not understand. I believed in some way I was called with a vocation. And later, if I may add a point, I'm not bragging, but I wrote a doctorate at the university on vocation.
Okay. On the subject of vocation.
The subject of vocation.
Okay. Let me ask you this: when were you ordained a priest? What year?
January 1945.
So 7 years after you became a friar or a brother, you were ordained a priest.
You're a quick thinker. That's pretty much right on target.
Okay. You felt a call.
I was working for a public utility.
You felt a call to become a priest, or is that the normal track for someone who's a friar? Did you feel a call to become a priest?
Well, I felt a call to become probably basically, a priest Franciscan.
Okay. So in other words, because not everyone who's a Franciscan or friar is a priest.
That's well said.
So that means that you must have felt you needed to become a priest?
Yeah.
Or did they ask you to become a priest?
It's the way I was brought up to believe, and I did believe in experience, and I think it's authentic, was a specific grace involved in the decisions I made.
Okay.
And that would be true, I think, in the case of someone such as you. You feel in some way you could not really explain that God called you to this specifically, not to be a Jesuit, not to go to be who and what you are. And it's that gives, in a sense, is it not true, brother, gives the deepest sense of meaning to your life, that Almighty God, by His grace, has called me to this, as best I can discern it.
Right.
And therefore, my response should be, as best it can, by God's grace, conformable to the choice I've made. So if I choose to enter the religious life, I take poverty, chastity, and obedience. I take those values. Poverty, which basically means I don't own anything. Chastity, which means complete abstinence from any deliberate sexual activity, of course, and to do as you're told when it's the right thing to do. You understand that as well or better than that.
So when you were ordained a priest, did you pastor a church? What was your sort of life path?
I could that's a good question, a fair question, and I can answer it very, very clearly. I have a very deep, very extensive academic background, including the best universities. I went to Harvard, George Washington University, Catholic University of America, University of Montreal. See, I'm not boasting because once you get in, as much as I was in the academic thing, you realize you haven't even started. But by ordinary standards, no credit to me, but because of the particular advantages, say graces, particular advantages I had, no credit to me. Just the whole academic thing was my life. I went to the best universities. I taught in universities. I did an enormous amount of writing and editing. All this fed into what I consider a vocation to a very simple lifestyle, very beautiful lifestyle. And I never, I'm just as stupid as I ever was. I went, no credit to me, but I went to a very expensive law school paid for by a congressman of Indiana, prep school, especially the Naval Academy and West Point and college. And then I went to the best universities for law school. All this was no credit to me. It was just the inpouring of God's goodness that led me finally, by God's grace, to meet the Franciscans and make a choice of something a life that I feel would be so simple, so basic. Get away from all this damn university stuff, and all this degrees, and all this academic. Get down to the fundamental stuff, which by God's grace, you have to do. If you enter a life like a Franciscan, here, you've got to do as you're told. You've got to behave yourself. Opportunities of service.
Service to people or?
Service in general. Service within the community to one another. But service to people as a priest. You're ordained not for yourself, but to serve others. To be if you're a priest, by God's grace, no credit to me, I am a priest. I was a priest. And I was a priest in a situation that made demands. But the more you respond, I found no credit to me. Number one was preparing young men for the Naval Academy and West Point in a first-class prep school.
Okay, that's not, you weren't in the Franciscans then. I mean,
yes, I was a Franciscan.
Oh, really?
Well, for part of that.
Okay.
By the time I...
So you actually went back to your prep school as a Franciscan?
Well, that's a good point, and it's right, pretty much right to the point. If it wasn't back to the prep school, it was back to what would be the prep school environment.
Okay.
And most of the people with whom I worked for going to the Naval Academy, many of them went to the same prep school that I went to.
Oh.
Which was one of the great prep schools, Swaley Prep in Virginia, famous for preparing young men for the Naval Academy. Many of whom reached good areas, but the West Point also.
So you like the teaching of the young men to prepare them for moving on?
Yeah, that's very well put. Yeah,
Okay.
but what my teaching developed into really was well, yeah. But I specialized in canon law. I specialized in canon law and in theology. I got a doctorate in both of those fields. I could honestly say, and I have to talk more about it if I got into it, was in service of mostly young men who had not had the opportunities that I had, which they could not even economically afford, but was provided for me partly by the wealth of my mother's family, but certainly by gratuities on the part of people. So the big thing as I look back was educating. I taught on the university level, I taught on the prep school level, I taught on a number of different levels, and an enormous amount of writing and edit, exactly what you say now.
Both law and theology?
Law and theology, because they were the two fields that I specialized in.
What was the name of one of your books? You remember any names?
Of what?
The titles of one of your books.
Oh, I never wrote a book.
You say you wrote, you mean if you include all those
I wrote
articles?
scores and scores
of
magazine articles.
I see. All right, okay.
Many.
And that's about the same as about 5 books.
Yeah, and you make more money by writing it.
Gotcha. Okay, so what day?
Pardon me, getting back. I wrote 1 or 2 books, doctorates.
For your...
Yeah, you got to do that, and you have to publish it as a book. Get your STD and so on.
I didn't do that. Yeah.
I'll be as honest as I can. The austerity and the simplicity of the Trappist lifestyle. I've been exposed to so much in many different areas that those two things are what held out to me as a very, very precious gift. And so it was relatively easy. In fact, I considered it a privilege to be accepted by this order after having been in so many different things that they would still accept me, somebody like me. And add to that the fact that the Trappist ideal, I hope is still there, but the Trappist ideal was in a sense giving yourself completely to something. And it still is, I guess. But when you read in the history of the Cistercians, the strict observance, the OCSO, then you get that idea of you've given it all to do this.
So now I'm going to ask you some questions about being a Trappist, but I'm concerned, I want to talk about Vatican II, because you came in 1969, which is after Vatican II, but you're aware of what the church was like before Vatican II.
That's a good question. Excellent question.
So how was religious life affected by Vatican II, and do you think it's better or worse or the same?
The religious life, what branch of it? This branch, monastic branch?
Well, talk about the one that you most feel comfortable to talk about.
Well, the one I experienced for 25 or 30 years was the Franciscan idea of emptying yourself of possessions of ownership, living a very simple lifestyle, and living in community, doing as you're told, observing the virtues, of course, of holy purity and integrity and so forth, and living according to a rule, R-U-L-E. And I was brought up in a fairly strict military family. And I loved what I lived, and I loved what I got. And as I look back, I haven't changed on that. It was a precious life of not a great deal of discipline, but let me make a point that it just really occurred to me, is my father was a very strict, old-line military officer. He had a high rank in the military. He was chief signal officer of the Third Army. And he was very strict. Not good at West Point, but he was good in what he was good in. And he was very, very strict and came from a rather needy family. My mother was very easygoing, brought up in a very generous environment, went to the best schools, had everything given her, and she married my father, and it was a good marriage, but they came from different backgrounds. And so I don't know exactly what I'm saying, but I consider even those elements, brother, as compelling me to face a reality that otherwise I would not have to have faced. That would have been through the Depression. Okay. See, anybody who went through the Depression years has a little bit of different attitude towards employment and money in life because of poverty, and it was awful in a sense. And even educated people couldn't get jobs. But my family's value that religious life contributed to the life of the church was emphasized by those years that you mentioned. And
there are some changes that reverberated through the Franciscan order. What changes did you...
That's correct. Life was a lot stricter before
Vatican II
than after Vatican II. And by stricter, I have to be careful because the word just occurred to me, brother. There was a humanizing that took place partly on part of the Depression and those years that you mentioned where you got down to earth and you faced difficulties and hardships. And of course, Depression years, you're talking about 1928, 1929, 1930, boy, that gave a whole new slant on life. And people who had money didn't have any longer. So your question is a good question. What I would say is, it's your concept of service that makes the difference. Now you have, how would I say this? I don't want to get into it, but you have a spirit of service. I don't know whether you recognize yourself, you should in a sense. And you would be the first to say no credit particularly to you. But say, you know what service is. And we had tremendous economic reverses that I went through, and you learned service. So women in my family who never would have got a job as a waitress, worked as waitress.
Right. And that's what you mean by I brought you back down to earth. Okay, so with Vatican II then, you say this, so that was a humanizing thing. Making it less strict means it was becoming more human.
That's beautifully said.
Okay, so that, considering the fact that it was making it more human, do you think that pre-Vatican II was less accurate in forming the person?
Pre-Vatican II was consistent with the culture of the time in the church.
Okay.
But Vatican II altered it all.
Okay. So you can't say one is better or worse, is that what you're saying?
No, and that's true, very well said. What you do say, it's different.
Yeah,
okay. In every respect. Obedience, service, finances, your level, standard of living. Well, normally, what is it? Temporary vows of 3 years, right?
Yes.
Well, you have a novitiate.
Well, you didn't have to do that, remember, because you came as a Franciscan.
Yeah, I forget what they call us now. Yeah, so I put in, 3 years and then took...
So you figure you took solemn vows in
but see, I already
1972?
had vows as a Franciscan,
You
so it
took,
facilitated.
yes, that's my whole point. So did you take your solemn vows in 1972?
Yes, that's right, 72. I know, I was elected abbot in 74.
Okay, so you were elected abbot, so you were an abbot.
Yeah,
You weren't
I was in long enough to be an abbot.
Okay. Okay, so in 74 you became an abbot.
For 5, yeah.
Did you expect to become an abbot?
No, indeed, I didn't. But I loved the life so much and was so attracted to the whole thing that I just moved right along. And so when it came to elections, I was very quickly elected. No credit to me, but see, I was 1974. I was at it for almost 15 years.
Right.
So 74 to 89. That's the way it was. But of course, I had never anticipated. I came in for the Franciscans, and I felt good. I'll be a Trappist brother, whatever you have to be, because the life is so attractive and so different, and so austere, and yet so beautiful that I took to the life. See, I sound like I'm boasting, I'm not. But I took to this life so quickly and so completely that when it came to electing, I got an enormous majority to be superior. And although I'm not even sure that I would be here long enough to be a superior, then I was re-elected.
2 more times.
Yeah, until I was too old. 70, I was almost 80, I guess, or whatever. 70, yeah. I was abbot from 74 to 90, to 89.
Okay.
15, 16 years.
Okay, so
Superior and abbot.
what can you tell us about that time period? What kind of things stand out in your mind? What events? What changes?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Well, see, it was a period of enormous changes within the church, consistent with one way or the other Vatican Council. And the changes were considered very, very radical in many ways. And so those who had been in the Franciscans for years, a number of them found difficult to accept, shall we say, the ease with which you could come in, and the lessening of the insistence on the Trappist thing. And that Trappist thing was very, very attractive. Maybe, I would say not in a false way, but it was a challenge. That word just hit me, brother, thank you. That you felt challenged to give yourself to this life. So, sure, I remember the increased emphasis on fraternity within the community, mutual service. That was a growth. The lessening of authority, a softening, more of a sense of camaraderie. That was consistent in the church in general. This Trappist order, boy, the abbot, whoo, man, no nonsense guy. And to really, by our standards today, not open to suggestion. It was overdone. And I came in as that Trappist abbot ideal began to soften out.
So you were a transition.
So I became 74. I became superior. And the reason for my part of that, I was not an old-time Trappist.
Ah.
See?
Yeah, so you could.
But I had been in another religious order for years, since 1928 or 48, or whatever it was. And so I was easily, by voting, I was elected, re-elected, or reappointed, whatever it was, because I was so taken up with the whole thing, but also I was introducing changes.
What kind of changes?
Freedom with which you could visit together, talk together, almost like almost recreation periods. I don't know whether we could connect. in other words, that was in the Universal Church. The Trappist thing was still in effect to some extent when I came superior in 74. 1974, I became superior. I was superior for 15 years. But in 74, already there was a certain softening out. The mere fact that I was elected to this life, who hadn't been an old-time Trappist, in a sense.
That in itself was a good revelation.
That's what I said.
Major change.
So the community, the mind was, we don't want to have an old-time Trappist abbot. Because
you don't want to stay in that same.
And plus the fact that Franciscans had a good reputation. See, very fraternal. That's the way we were brought up. And how would I say this? What they learned, yes, they could participate in my decision, but when the chips are down, I can make a decision. Right. And that, as I look back, I want to get into all that, is partly due to my military family background. You reason things, you talk about things, but when a decision is made, it's made. That's all. You may still be open to talk about it, but in our case here, you can be elected and re-elected up to a certain point.
Right.
And so I was from 74 to 90, 15 years actually, I was superior.
And at that time, that was in the chicken business, right? Egg business?
No, I went in the egg business. But see, I was and still am a pretty stupid guy. Really. But the people I was with, they weren't stupid.
Okay.
And now because they elected. They elected me. So that proves they were stupid after all. 74 to 90, I guess, 16 years. Well, that was a prosperous time. I would guess in retrospect that I dealt with maybe people coming, they didn't all stay, if you don't do that. I'm talking about a pretty good number of people, see, because as you check the records, that was a big time for the religious life, including the Franciscans.
Right.
So I would say, roughly, I figured it at one time, I messed around with about 20, which was about the number in the community. See. But even as it is now, the Trappist thing was very attractive until they came and found out they had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and go out and feed chickens and do what you do still. I mean, you have I think the same sort of not much sense to that, but you did it. But by the time you came, things were getting more rational. I hate to say it, more rational than under the old-time Trappist thing. See, there was a certain ideal which wasn't really any longer operative. Participation in community was an introduction. The abbot was the boss. And no nonsense about it. The abbot said that's the way it is. But the whole idea of community in the church, that's the universal, same in the Franciscans. There was an opening up to sharing this thing. When you were, in the old days, under a Trappist abbot, my Lord, the abbot, ooh. And if the abbot called you into his office, you would go to his office, but boy, but it was how would I say that? That was authentic and that was okay, but that's the way it was. The sense of community, the sense of community, that's all second Vatican stuff, in a sense, pre-Second Vatican. See, the sharing in the lifestyle, sense of community. As far as I can discern here, we have a good sense of community, but that isn't the way it used to be. Everything turned on authority. See, it was quasi-military. It was quasi-military. And nowadays, would the abbot be giving a penance to a monk here now? He might think about it. He isn't likely to do it. But it used to be that
Tennis was all the time.
the abbot called you into his office, oh boy, and he could put certain demands on you, like extra work. And I don't know, maybe sometimes, maybe like doing out dessert. In other words, the sense of community wasn't articulated enough. The sense of authority was there. And that's why military people, in the old days, military people rose to the top in these Trappist communities for the most part, because they had been, and in other orders too, other religious orders. If you were military from a strict, especially a commissioned officer, and went into religious life, you were destined probably for a court officer. That's all, thank God. Is that I've always, by God's grace, I've always seen need for, the necessity for, and the grace of recognizing talents, gifts, endowments, whatever you want to call them, in someone legitimate, and encouraging them to develop them. I had many responsibilities, if I may say so, dealing with people who were superior to me intellectually, athletically, and almost any way you want to talk about, better men than I, maybe better women than I. So when I speak with a person such as yourself, I recognize the potentialities and the actualities. That's the difference. That is potentially over here. Now it is actually over here. That's a realization of potentiality. That lamp is not here. It's there. Potentially, it's here. Right. It means by the power. And you understand that as well as I. So if I reach over, or you reach over, then it is actually here. It's not just potentially here. It's actually here. Because the potentiality of its being here has been realized by my reaching over and pulling it over. So by analogy, when I speak with someone such as yourself, I recognize in large measure, what we call the natural gifts. The supernatural gifts, in that sense of grace and closest to Almighty God, that's not something for me to get into an ordinary dealings with someone. That's between him and a spiritual director, squatting around places like some young people, or maybe not so young, and spend a great part of the time just drinking a beer and talking and yapping. So the year passes, and what has happened? We look back over it, not much at all important has happened. Not that we should be driving ourselves all the time, no. But it's wrong if we don't use as best we can, under God's grace, and with help from people who are experienced and knowledgeable and so forth, to help us to grow in a direction that enriches others, and by enriching us. In all evidence, God has called you to a special life, and God has given you special gifts, and you are a very capable person, and you have potentialities that have not been actualized. In other words, that over there can be moved here, but it's moved by outside forces. That's the same way with our growth, in a sense. Educationally, academically, in other ways, physically, athletically, and so forth. So I'm not going to keep on talking, but what I'm trying to make the point is, I'm